Okay, cool. So this is building query for April 6th. Oh my gosh, 2020. I say oh my gosh every time. Um, I sort of had three very simple agenda points based on conversations we as a team had earlier in the day, but I think we'd love to look at the wires Chris drew up for integrating SQL into the front end. Oh yeah, Asmir will be demoing the autocomplete from the command line. And then I think we can talk in general terms or specifics about the next release of Qri Desktop. Is that going to be 050? No? Okay. Well, whatever we call it.
Probably a patch.
Okay. And then as well, if we get Christos on the call, great, but otherwise we can just preview the latest data stories from the people who wrote them. So if Rusty wants to tell us a little bit about the CalParks data set, that'd be great. And not sure if Chris Wong will be here to talk about turnstile data and other stuff, but that's plenty, I think. And in addition to that, whatever's on our users' minds, which is the whole point of this call. So cool. So how do we want to start?
Asmir, do you just want to jump right into it?
Sure, why not? Actually, while I'm at it, I just found actually a bug, so we'll fix that along the way, but I'll show the working parts. It's actually all good. I just worked a little bit off the search. Anyway, so for those who are unfamiliar, I'm kind of like new to query, but hacking around, and I guess usability was kind of the focus of the last sprint, and I kind of like tried to do my best on that front. As part of that, like getting started with query and also like navigating all the commands was a little bit tough for me just to get my like head around all of those. So I really wanted to have autocomplete, so I did it actually. And here's just a short demo of it in action. God, I got a ton of windows open. This one should be good. Yep. So let me know if you can actually see my screen.
Totally. Could you bump the font by one size at least?
Absolutely. Oh, that's good. Cool. So yeah, I used like what we already had quite a bit. So just wanted to extend that to add some basic autocomplete functionality. Right now, you should be able to kind of like find the info about it here in the help. And essentially, it supports Bash and ZSH. Other versions, I'm not really sure. If anybody uses something else, I think it's fair to say if they ask for it or push an issue or something like that, I think we can actually easily accommodate for a few more, like normal shell, fish, or something like that. Depends who uses what. Not sure how far it functions on the Windows machines, but yeah, we'll see. So yeah, pre-completion, and you can then just add either Bash or ZSH, and what it does is actually outputs all the fancy stuff for the autocompletion. But what most people should do is do something like this. And that should actually activate our prep. Query, help, or completion.
You either have an extra caret or you're missing a caret.
Yeah, I did it the wrong way around. So, and that should generally do the trick, I guess.
You pipe that into query, not source.
Oh, yeah. The demo gods are not looking upon me. Anyways, that actually gives you the ability to just type out commands and hit tab repeatedly to just figure out what you want to do with it. I don't know. Registry is one of the few that actually doesn't really cover it all. So this was a base implementation to get basic things going as command completion, kind of flag completion, and most importantly, dataset name completion. So whenever you want to get your dataset name or something like that, you should be able to actually just hit tab, and it gives you all the datasets that are actually locally available. There's also the search version that actually hits up the query cloud and tries to fetch all the like relevant search terms and give you back the data sets that match that. But actually, that's the one thing that's buggy right now, and I have to fix. I think I omitted a few lines from the shell script. So anyways, you can now tab through all the commands and get all the dataset names that you have locally. So let's do something like this. And then we can do, I don't know, no prompt, and then types like directly and so on. One more addition to this is, let me actually do another one, is that you can, I think we can do it like this. Where you have a file prompt, you can actually give it a file name, so it will autocomplete file names as well. On Bash, it works a little bit better because it utilizes the real autocomplete. On ZSH, because it's not really well supported, it actually does only like the local like autocompletion that you get from your general shell. So if you do something like, I don't know, and then it just lists you all the files and folders that actually match. It does the same thing on ZSH as well. So yeah, that's it in a nutshell. I guess everybody should kind of like just try it out and just start hitting tab to see like what happens. But essentially, it's there to help you get smoothly through query. So yeah, if
That's
anybody has
fantastic.
comments or ideas how to expand it, feel free to add something. There's also an issue on the issue board, so yeah, go ham on it.
I think the issue was filed in 2017, if I'm not mistaken.
Wow.
Asking for autocompletion on the command line. So this is a long time coming. Yeah, we should check the date on that one. But I'm delighted to have this. I've been using it all week, and it's an order of magnitude easier.
I saw Rob physically clap, and I saw Rusty type clap, clap, clap into the chat. So that's wild applause. If you didn't hear that in the audio portion of the of the recording.
Of the podcast edition.
Yeah. Cool. Any questions about that from anybody?
We did have a question about fish support. Rusty, feel free to file an issue. I'd love it if you could try to see. We should just look up what Fish's autocomplete API looks like and which one is closest to. But if you file the issue, at least if other people, like we've had a lot of people on Arch Linux, and so like just having Arch Linux issues helps others see that we're talking about it and has helped other people pile on. So if you file the fish issue, at least that'll let us know if other people want to fly by and say, me too, then that'll be useful. Cool.
Yeah, go ahead, Brent.
Rico, can I totally like override that schedule? Is
sure.
Not allowed. Chris is here and we have time to talk about SQL, but Abe had a question about search, and I think it would be really interesting, Abe, to just get your input on what you were thinking about search and see if we could kick off a discussion. I'd just rather start it earlier in the call rather than later in case other people needed to drop off.
Wonderful.
If that's okay. Chris, do you mind if we do the SQL wires after?
Sure. Say when.
Cool. Yeah, Abe. So just to give some background, Abe had some questions on the Discord about just basically what search is going to be like, and love to get some context from you and see if we can figure out how that dovetails together.
Yeah, I'll keep it brief because you all know way more than I do about this great project. But I'm sort of coming from a world of like full text search, where you throw whole data sets into Elasticsearch, and then you can get very granular results back for like record level, like sub record level, more like cell level results. And so that was always really great, but as we were sort of agreeing on in the Discord channel, that comes at a cost where everything's like ingested into this cluster, or I guess there's probably distributed solutions to do that. But I'm just curious, like, are you mostly focused on the metadata side of things, and then just going to kind of see how inter-dataset search plays out in the future, or do you have specific plans to support very deep search of these data sets?
That's a fantastic question. And I think I really just wanted you to ask it because I think you're the first person to really, truly surface this question. Because the type of search you're describing is a little different than what a lot of the work that we've been doing right now, which is very centered around data set discovery, right? Like the idea of finding something based on a connection to a keyword or a key phrase that you're interested in. So great, yay, we can take you to the front door of a data set, but doing this sort of exploratory data analysis style search where you're like trying to understand within this data set what are its constituent pieces. I think is like are sort of the two camps that I tend to think about it in, even though they're not completely distinct. I think there's some like short-term wins that we can do very quickly. Qri has a stats generating tool, which basically can generate column-metric. It can just look for unique values inside of a column. Yeah. Yes, Rusty Abe is iRobot. Sorry to connect you to and identify you. Abe. I don't know. Should have asked for that first. I apologize. But the what was I gonna say? Yeah. So if we just put the stats results into an index, I think that would be the first fastest solution. We also have questions about history, like versions of data sets, because we not only have whole data sets, but we track whole data sets over time. And I think that's a big question that we should really be asking. I think there's scenarios where like there's a data set that starts applicable to one context and then sort of morphs over time to not be so applicable. To pluck a somewhat contrived but real recent example, Chris has been working on turnstile data set and has found some conversations about how the Long Island Railroad, which transit system takes Metro cards in New York, but the PATH trains should not actually be part of, it's not that they shouldn't be part of it, but they shouldn't be part of the analysis. And so there's a question of like, pretend for a second we released a version of that data set that took PATH trains out of it and all those values out. Like ideally you'd have search results that would sort of delineate search for sort of PATH train in New York combinatorials. And so for that, I think there's some cheap wins out of just taking all of the stats that we generate and jamming those into Elasticsearch as well. But full text search at the sub-cell level would require a different kind of feature that we had initially had in Qri and ripped out because we found it too expensive, which is basically a local search index. So you could, on your own machine, you could take any data set that you wanted and it was automatically generating a data set in a search index that you could use locally to operate on. Currently, the index that we work against is a centralized one that's run on Qri Cloud. So as Asmir was mentioning, we can demo with autocomplete, and if you do Qri add and then you hit tab on some letters, it will do a search and get you back results from a cloud-based service. But a long time ago, we had a level DB backed thing called, what was the search engine we were using? Levy. Levy was the name of the search index that we were using. And so the theory there was, okay, people should be able to grow and tune their own local search indexes against whatever they want, basically building up your own full text search against whatever. There's nothing that should stop you from being able to suck down a bunch of data sets, entire histories even from the network, and then build an index against those. So you're the first person to surface that kind of thing. That's definitely like not even on the roadmap right now, but I'd love to know like how that sub row level search sort of impacted your day-to-day work, or where you see the use case for that.
Yeah, for sure. And to be clear, I'm not suggesting that without this, it's somehow incomplete. I think that what you have is very compelling. So this should not take away from that at all. But really a lot of the power from the cell level search came from unique identifiers, particularly in public data where you have, like a classical example would be corporate registration split across 3 different tables, and there's a unique ID that joins all of them. And so I guess, briefly, like I used to work for Enigma and I was heavily involved with Enigma Public. And so our policy for ingesting public data sets of that nature was we bring in the tables individually, and we tried to like reproduce what they were in the wild, and we didn't do a join unless we had some like corporate reason to do so. But if you just type in one of those like identifiers, you might get a bunch of other hits, but you definitely would get hits for like all 3 distinct tables in a corporate registration. And then you immediately know, and we didn't do a good job of surfacing the linkages, but you could if that was something you were after. So that was like the biggest real world case, I think, for why that was powerful. And especially since with Elasticsearch, you get a lot of fuzzy searching for free, and you get this whole syntax that we just sort of expose on the front end. So that kind of thing was really big for our users and for me in particular.
That makes a ton of sense, and really like that actually segues nicely into some of what we're working on lately, which is we've sewn SQL on top of the query, sort of like dataset runtime, as it were. And with the theory being that we want to get to a position where we're pulling any dataset that we want and joining them like with using SQL queries. Begs the question, like, how do you figure out what tables are joinable in the first place? And it sounds like this is like sort of a nice setup for that, a sort of bridging function between the two. Rob?
I was just going to maybe echo that use case with Edgy's work on Echo. So I know I haven't been heavily involved in that stuff, but I know one of the things I came across is concerns about like the Echo user interface. So if other people aren't familiar, it's the environmental compliance something database, but it's EPA's database for compliance monitoring and enforcement. Oh, it's enforcement and compliance, something. Anyway, when you browse it on the web, it takes all its underlying data and has a whole bunch more nice synthesized information that it can surface for you, but it only does the last like year or 3 years or something. You can download the raw data, but it's all in like separate tables, and there's a whole bunch of joins you have to do with unique identifiers like this in order to like create the kind of things they show in the UI. I know some people have been trying to deal with that. So similar super use case.
Yeah, totally. This is a biggie. I mean, I'm wondering, to me, this immediately jumps out this idea of like inside of our schema, because we're JSON schemas, like wouldn't it be amazing if we had some sort of hinting technique where you could sort of hint at unique identifiers, or at least an ID column? That seems like something that has been asked for in a number of places. It would help the SQL implementation, and it would be a nice filtering heuristic for indexing. Rob?
I mean, along those lines, it would be super nice to be able to have something that is like that and points at sort of another data set name, or even like the ideal, although it gets complicated with the versioning and everything, is like an actual like foreign key column that's like data set name version row, right? But it would be super nice to be able to just say in the schema column, like at least like this is an identifier that like the canonical table that this is referencing is like Mr. Ogrog / whatever, you know, from some data set. Even if that doesn't get validated, a super useful hint.
Yeah, it's like a reverse many-to-many lookup of like, given this identifier, what dataset names graph to that. So that's sort of what we're getting at. Yeah. Sounds really big and really expensive.
I mean, I think it would be nice to be able to support even just being able to put something in there that indicates that, even if it is in no way validated or no way like technically meaningful, like give somebody the right hints to be like, oh, this data set's connected to this other one. So if I want to do something useful with it, I need to go grab this other one.
I actually did something similar to that with the turnstile data this past weekend, or maybe on Friday, but in the description field for one of my columns, I referenced another data set. So not quite what you're describing, but it definitely says it should be one of the IDs from this other data set. So poor man's version.
It's really interesting. Abe, do you have anything to add?
Oh, just making me think of things that we always wanted to do and never did them. So yeah, some of these IDs are interesting because I mean, you know, we have like formal schemas for string and date time and numeric and stuff like that, but you can kind of think of a very specific ID in the same way. Like if I, so I have a project where I've been trying to show all public data on a specific date. And so that's required me to find APIs that, or data sets that have a, date or date time, and then query each one individually and like pull back everything for a given date. And those things are often not related at all. And that's sort of the whole idea. But a lot of these, like I'm trying to think of, like DUNS is an identifier, or like industrial classification identifiers that span, not just like corporate sets, but then they're found in like other business sets. And those things are sometimes can be considered in the same way that we would think of a date, where it's like this universal thing, but it's less about tagging relationships and more at the schema level, like, oh, this thing is not just like a string identifier, it's a string identifier of this very specific variety. And then instead of tagging the two corporate data sets together, you just make sure that that column has that same specific schema, and then you sort of get that relationship for free without having to have a separate list of like, okay, these data sets are formally related, if that makes sense.
Totally. This is really where I think that another school of thought is, I think this is where you start to get a version of RDF that emerges out of this, where it's like, okay, cool, we need sort of a hierarchical relationship of types sort of grafted into a triple store type thing. We're of the mind that I've yet to see RDF really take off, and it's been 20 something years. And so it's I think that there's something challenging there. But what you've just sort of talked about is like, what we could express right now in query today is like, set the validation requirement to strict, so like you can't have errors in this column, and supply a sufficiently unique regular expression. And what we've been looking at down the road to sort of like get at some of this is the idea of like the way that the way we're sort of working with JSON schema right now is JSON schema gives you the capacity to sort of link schemas together. You can say like, hey, this thing, the definition of this is over there. One of our ongoing projects, we don't have the definition of a link inside of query yet. Right now, everything is discrete and sort of discretized inside of a single package. But given that we have content addressing as our sort of foundation, referencing immutable stuff is actually like a really smart idea when you're talking about. And so like the long-term idea here is to build like a real linked data platform where the links, if they rot, it's because the data's gone. It's not because the data's changed. And the value there would be if you could start to establish this sort of taxonomy of canonical links, or even sort of canonically shaped links. So like the fuzzy version of this is, hey, are you using the same regular expression? The not so fuzzy version of that is, are you like literally pulling from the same schema.org-esque definition of a column? And if we're saying these are both Dun and Bradstreet identifiers for businesses, then we automatically get the lookup table for free. Even if they're invalid, which would be a really nice sort of like characteristic to have. For this to work, we need to implement something called interplanetary link data, which is, yeah, I did that specifically to get Rob to laugh, which is like a technology under the hood. But once we can do that, and this idea of link resolution, we could really get really close to that, where you can not only specify those schemas, but we can build UI that says, hey, you're trying to build a schema, and this column looks a lot like this. Do you want to make this a Dun and Bradstreet identifier? And now you have this like really fast, way to sort of wire up your data to other data that it will naturally join to. It'll mean more labor on the part of the user, but we think that it's an important step to take to explicitly opt into being a part of a schema. We could write fancy tools that try and detect that for you and suggest that for you, but I think that that's really not so far off, and doesn't require us building a massive search index, which I think is a really interesting characteristic to have. Does that comport?
Totally. That's exciting that you're already considering that. And RDF definitely needs some attention. Like, as you said, it's sort of this like, so much potential, but there hasn't been, a ton of accessible applications for it.
This actually just got me thinking of like a much poorer version of this, thinking about the idea of like being able to specify columns as relating to columns in other named data sets in query. having some, like, again, like way poorer version of it, but something on the like data set level, or somewhere in the schema, I don't know like exactly where the right spot is, but if you had columns that referenced other data sets in some way, like, again, this is on the level of like not trying to necessarily validate anything, but provide a more structured way to have the right pointers rather than just throwing it in a description. To have query be able to, like, when you save, if you have that data set locally, then on some high level say like these other data sets are referenced at these versions. If you have it locally, or if it's published somewhere, then at the latest version that was published or whatever. Just so like when somebody looks it up again, not only do they have the information about like, oh, this references these other data sets that might be useful, but also like a hint at what is probably the most valid version of that data set for that reference.
100%. And we presently do, this is exactly the technique we apply to transforms right now. So I just dropped a link into the chat showing exactly that example. Rob, what you're getting at is being able to manually specify those, which I think is really interesting and would really apply to what you were doing, Chris, where you're saying, hey, this column references this data set version. Just to sort of like walk everybody through how this works, the version that I've just referenced uses, Abe, I don't know if have you seen any of our transform stuff?
No, I have so many questions, but I'm not going to ask them because I need to spend some time with the docs.
And if you find problems with said docs, let us know. They are a work in progress, but they're a lot better thanks to a major effort led by Chris. Long story short, transforms are a way to bind data to code, or code to data. And so you can write Python basically in a sandbox environment that will automate the updating of a data set. And so on subsequent saves, it will run whatever code you want. In the example that I've just linked in chat, there is on the sort of fourth non-comment line of code, there's a load data set function that gets called. And when you call that, if we actually look at this data set in the wild, Query.io, B5, World Bank population. Oh, that's Query.cloud, my bad. This might actually be worth sort of just diving in on in a second, for 1 second. Oh, actually, we can't see this from cloud. We'll have to go to the actual, drop down to the IPFS side. 1 second. Query list. This autocomplete, I'm telling you. Just want to quickly pull this out just for the sake of proving it. So if we look at, this is going to look really eccentric, but this is a link to the distributed web of the transform script that ran at that version. And if you look at it, you'll see inside of it a resources link and then a reference. And then on the key is actually the exact hash of the data set that you referenced. And then the path is the actual name that you use to refer to it. And so what we want to do with this is we want to be able to say, cool, now we have an explicit dependency tree for data sets and we know when they're out of date. And so we can say this data set was used, depends on this other data set. And we can now use the network to go to understand when that data set has changed and know that you need to rerun that query to get more updated, or rerun that transform script to get the updated version of your data. So Rob, what you're kind of describing is like a simple way of connecting data sets with a manual reference, basically saying, hey, can I embed a manual reference to another data set? This feels like a really straightforward, like it's literally exactly this code. It's just instead of automatically embedding it, we're letting users specify valid references. The validation for this would just be, hey, is this a reference that you have or can prove existed at the time you made it? And then that would allow us to sort of walk those dependency trees automatically as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's very much along those lines. I guess I'm thinking of it as slightly different in the sense that what you're theoretically tracking in the transforms is like a dependency on data from which you synthesized something in this new data set, versus we're talking more about like a foreign reference, but those overlap a lot, right? There's at least 50% overlap in those concepts. So for sure, but also I have a known bias against transforms for other reasons. But yeah.
Because we can't boil the ocean with a Python-like thing. Yeah. But yeah, I totally agree. But I just think it'd be a really interesting feature. Like currently we have metadata that lets you sort of specify, hey, these are citations of people who worked on this. Like, why can't we just cite other data sets? This feels like a pretty straightforward thing to build. Someone on Qri team yell at me if that feels really scary. Okay, no one's shaking their heads on video. Dustin?
I need more detail, but I don't know. No strong feelings either way yet.
I like it. Cool. This is really helpful because I feel like we started with let's build a full text search of every data set ever to get the value of being able to cross-link, and ended with, wait, there's some simple things here that we could do that would at least allow us to manually specify linkages. And then what we can sort of, the last thing I'd want to mention here is there's nothing that stops anybody from crawling and grabbing all of the data on Qri and starting to try and apply their own logic to understand how to better connect up the world of data sets. And like, I think we really want to encourage that, given that this is a thing that we're trying to create a public asset here. And so like, it'd be really fun to see somebody say, cool, I built a thing that just grabs one data set off of Qri at a time and runs it through whatever. I mean, I'm going to use the word magic machine learning algorithm right now to specify something that I don't fully understand. But some sort of set of techniques to try and understand how can we better correlate this data, because I think that would be a wonderful thing to see. But yeah, that's also like, we don't have to be the only ones who build that by any means. I think it would be really interesting to say, yeah, other folks have built their own indexes. They're fun and interesting. And but for us, the short-term wins for us that are really straightforward, I think, are just getting column stats into our Elasticsearch index, which will start to get unique values. And then being able to specify this column as an identifier is the next thing in that roadmap. After that, I would ideally sometime in late this year, the linked data stuff lands for other reasons. And then we can start to port that over into linked schemas. And then once that's up and running, we can build UI on top of it. And then by the end of this year, we finally have a, hey, wire up your duns column to somebody else's duns column, and let's traverse through all of it and automatically generate SQL queries that join those things, because that's not far away.
That's pretty exciting. I'll just say I have to hop off pretty much now because I have a meeting coming up for my actual job. But I just wanted to say I downloaded the Mac client like 2 months ago on my work computer, and then I hadn't updated it until today, like before this meeting, and it was like, it looked way different. There was like Times New Roman font in random places, and then I updated it and it's like totally different. So it's amazing what you've all done in 2 months. And so I'm looking forward to keeping an eye on this project, and if I can be of any help at all, let me know. I don't want to take up your meeting talking about search, because that's something I'm thinking about all the time. But yeah, thank you for including me today.
Thanks so much for joining. And this is exactly what we want to do. This is why we have these calls, is literally to just solicit feedback. And yeah, we're delighted. We consider issues and people telling us what doesn't work a major contribution. That's really the mode that we're in right now. So if you want to file issues against our repositories, we would be delighted. Yeah. So thank you so much for joining.
No problem. Good
Thanks,
luck,
Abe.
everyone. Stay safe.
Likewise.
Thank you. You too. Awesome. That's great.
That was great.
Search is fun. Cool. Chris, do you want to demo the wires for the SQL pane, just so we can get some feedback on those?
The wire.
The wire.
All right. Let's see if we can get off of my Twitter for a second and go to preview. Okay. Sure. So what I put together here is inspired very heavily by Carto, which is where I worked for a little while a few years back. But one of the things that I really loved about Carto, and that I always touted about them when I worked there and beyond, is that they're hands down the sort of fastest way to get started with a data set, basically querying a data set with SQL So they have really great ingress. You can just drag a CSV in and you just get this instant table, and then you can start running SQL on it, whether you're a beginner or you're advanced. But they also have a really great UI for it. So, this is inspired by that, with adding a few things that I always found missing that I think would be extremely helpful. But to start with, this would be a top-level pane inside Qri Desktop, the SQL pane. So you would click on it, along the sidebar on the left. And then basically you get a table view for your result set. You get a SQL query editor that'll do like syntax highlighting for you. And then you can hit the execute button and it'll run and populate the table. If you have an error, it'll throw up a little error here and tell you what the engine didn't like about your query, whether you got a file name wrong or table that doesn't exist or something like that. Sorry, I mean column name. You can also go back and forth with these guys and just go back to your previous queries and copy and paste them if you need to. So it'll kind of keep track of what you've done recently. So other than SQL Editor and Table View, the things that I would highlight here are this little guy is a schema preview. And I think just in my personal experience and from what I've heard a lot from others, when you're really wrangling SQL with unfamiliar data sets, you find yourself constantly having to either write down somewhere the names of the columns or have another query handy that will just do a select all with one row limit, so you can actually see what the column names are and what kind of entries are in them. So this is just kind of a schema preview for everything that you have in your local collection, where you can quickly see the column names and column types just as a reminder. Maybe we could do some interesting things like double click them and it'll just put them into the SQL editor or something like that. But for now, it's just a simple way you can search here and filter with a simple text search, name and description maybe, or just name and username and dataset name maybe. But then get this little expanded list where you can just see the names and the descriptions, which is a little helpful. And then a couple other things up here, these context buttons, where you're sure as soon as you filter out the 100 rows you're interested in out of the 100,000 row data set, you're going to want to export to CSV. So we have a nice little export button. And then probably a new data set from result, which is interesting, where you can do a query on something and then, basically make a new data set, maybe have the options to copy over metadata and copy over structure and things like that. And then you've started a new data set off of some other data set. So I think that's pretty much the talk of how this is going to work, but would love to hear feedback and suggestions.
This looks super awesome. And it would be super cool to have like some level of stats and other things, or like some way to preview some example values from the schema. Just so you can quickly be like, oh, that's always X number of digits or whatever. Sometimes that's super helpful, I think. But like just having that schema preview is so great. So it's super awesome. And the other thing that jumps out at me is new data set from result makes me think about the same thing that I kind of keep complaining about, which is the question about how do I sort of like follow or always be updated on another data set. Like what the conclusion that I jump to from what I want, although new data set from result is entirely in like theoretical value land in my head, but like the thing that I jump to is the idea of treating that sort of like you might have a view or something in a more traditional relational database. So I really want this to be like a live thing. So whenever I update the data sets that it's depending on, then this also sort of like gets updated. That would be super cool. But
Awesome.
Obviously like way farther out there.
Yeah, my first thought when I saw the new data set from results, I got excited about it because I felt like that is like something that feels like something we would want out of this. But then my next thought was like, uh-oh, is this another component on data set? And now we have like SQL, transform or whatever. So yeah, I'm not totally sure how it all fits together, but it feels like something that we want to be doing. So
Well, new data set from result is more of a materialized view because it makes a new data set. But it would be, yeah, you're right. It would be cool if like the transform inside that data set when it's created is the SQL, maybe. So you can just run the transform again, and that's how it gets linked. So it's kind of this like loose linkage. But yeah, maybe there's another button that is a view, which is like, you're right. That's a whole other thing we'd have to build that is a whole new entity, but it could be this like, well, no, I don't know. I don't know what it would be like. I'm out of my wheelhouse there, but I'll let somebody else comment on that. But I love the idea.
This reminds me of something we were talking about ages ago, where in cases like Viz, back when that was like a major thing we were doing, you'd want to have like a subset of your data set so that you had, a JavaScript page with not the entire data set in the body, but rather just the parts you cared about that you wanted to graph somehow. And like this could be sort of the same thing where like you want to create a view basically, but it doesn't necessarily have to be a commit in your full history because, I might have 20 versions after a while and I want to have the same view over each of them, right? But they're not like linear in that sense. They're like, the views are like kind of children coming off of each individual commit. And then, they don't have to follow the same structure, the same column names or whatever, they could have whatever form they want. But yeah, I don't know, random thought there.
It might be super nice to be able to like save some of the queries within Qri. Like just this like with some extra description type metadata or something that you could reference back to and reuse.
Yeah, having them as structured transforms would be really good.
I mean, I was actually thinking also maybe like send this to the Readme thing would be helpful. Because it's like, yeah, you constantly are coming up with like, it would be cool to be able to like automatically send your query to the Readme and like it'll pop up a little thing that says, what is this? And you can annotate it. And then that'll just be there. And then, it'll warn you that like, oh, by the way, you have a working copy of this that you haven't committed on yet, but like you should totally, commit this so that other people can see the interesting queries you've come up with.
Alternatively, what if Readmes had like a magic tag that would basically be insert the transform here, right? So that way it's like actually linked and like you can't make a mistake in like copying it or mutating it or whatever.
Cool. Yes, that sounds awesome.
I think on that note, like what would be kind of neat is I don't know if you do like code highlighting and naming types of code in fence code blocks in the Readmes, but like if you mark something as SQL or as like query SQL or something, then in the rendered version it might have like a button next to it that says like run this. That would be super cool.
We're recreating Jupyter notebooks.
On the fly.
Well, don't get that far, but yeah.
Not to be a jerk, but
please don't go that far. I think,
Rika, are you the only one who's been around long enough to remember the white paper where we took this was the original reason we wanted transforms.
Right, maybe me and Rob.
Yeah, totally. This was the first syntax for transforms was SQL, and we ripped it out and put in whose side? Me, maybe. I'm delighted to see this come full circle. Like this new data set from result is the button we've been aiming for a long time. So we've actually already written the paper on why this should be a thing. Because not only can the original thesis was not only can you use the queries, but you can actually, so a couple of things, because you're building on a hash link structure, everything Dustin's describing, the results, so you could save a query and say, hey, this is a view on a data set. You can leave it uncalculated, but the result of that calculation is deterministic. So you can cache that result. And it's also a deterministic, as long as you know, hey, use this version of query to execute this thing, you're always gonna get the same result. And so like you can put all kinds of these queries all over the place. And as you've been saying, Dustin, it's just like, as long as you can assume there's a runtime that can execute that, then you can do stuff like visualizations that do derived views. You can do readmes that have derived views and leave them unexecuted. And also we can sort of like leave that stuff in a cache so it runs one time and then it's done. it's very, very cacheable. It's also something that long term, you can actually ask peers to compute for you. If you ask multiples for the same and then get the hash results, then you know if someone's lying to you because they're deterministic processes, which means that we open the door to sort of like completely decentralized computation when you're in a context where that's totally light. But anyways, that button, that new data set from result button, I think is like everything we just talked about earlier in the hour with embedded references is exactly that, right? It's like, hey, I took this data set and I ran this SQL on it. And that's just like a one. And that's why we, as mentioned on the call, but like we intentionally wrote a preprocessor that can suck the data set references out of an SQL string. And we intentionally kept that separate from the SQL processor for this exact reason, so that we can build the dependency graph before we ever execute the SQL. Which will allow us eventually to do automatic resolution of that. Say, hey, just go download for me all the data sets I need to run this query, which is fun for people who just want fast and automatic. Also, we can give you a preview of how much information that's going to download before you actually do it. But then you can also say, hey, we're exactly referencing this stuff, and then we just use logbook to know when things change and give you alerts about it. As you said, Chris, we can compose the actual outputs of these with really nice UI and say, cool, run this query, pull the metadata from here, pull the blah from there, and a lot of our sort of friendly commit work really comes into play nicely here. We can say, hey, the metadata for this came from here, or like if I'm doing a left, the like nightmare scenario where like I'm doing a left join of like a couple of different data sets. It's like, do I favor the column descriptions from A or B? And like you can sort of make some smarter decisions around that. But I'm excited. This is the world that we gotta live in soon. More concretely on the wireframes that were being presented. The one thing I did want to bring up, Casey, I don't know if you were in chat while we were talking about this. I think that preview column looks really nice. And actually, I think is a better expression of our current, of what we're doing right now for our schema segment view, where we have the type on the left, and then I think this is just like a nicer, more readable version of it. I'd love to know your thoughts on that. Because ideally we just harmonize them, right? Like ideally that's just like the same thing and the same component used in both places. But I just want to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, it's you're referring to like what we have right now for the schema editor. Yeah, I mean it's also just more compact and thank you. Yeah. So are you, and specifically you're talking about like the type on the left? Yeah, I think that'll make sense. It does make more sense to, feels like it makes more sense to have the type on the left. And,
yeah, I just want to keep those components consistent. Yeah, totally. Yeah. But I'm also just trying to put your mind at ease a little bit as we go to build this. Like we should ideally duplicate a bunch of these components that we're like, more importantly, reinforcing for the user when they look at the segment display, you're actually looking at a preview of the columns that you could one day query. Like that should be like a direct translation when someone's looking at a data set preview. I'd like them to sort of be thinking about, oh, this is sort of the same queue that I'm getting when I'm looking at this sort of compacted view. Yeah, this is really exciting. So I think we should just go forth and try and build this and see what happens.
So we don't have validation in the schema preview, and I was curious if that was a choice, Chris, or if you think they might belong here or not. And if it doesn't belong here, where does it belong in the schema editor as it relates to this?
Sorry. No, I don't think it was, wasn't a choice. I think it was just kind of I need to type the name and the description at the very least. And I think others have already mentioned that like, now I want to know what are the types of things that are in these columns so that instead of having to write a query to figure that out, it would be nice to just see like the types of things that are in there so I can refresh my memory of what to expect and what the different types are or what the different values can be. So stats would be good. I just imagined a little like ... menu on the right here where there's a bunch of other stuff you could pull up in like a little pop-up for each one or something without taking up too much real estate in the actual list. yeah, for sure, validation as well, like, is maybe below the fold, but a thing you can explore quickly and figure out, like, oh, all of these must be, you know, greater than 50 or something like that.
Yeah, I think that's that kind of stuff I'd really like to see us just, let's get this basic thing executed and then see how we want to iterate from there. But to me, the biggest thing I think we wanted to make sure we were on the right track for is just general layout. Where do we want to go? What do we want to build first? Yeah, I'm really excited to see this exist. This is going to be really fun. Yeah. Well, Chris was helping us. You can speak to this, Chris, but like you actually used and you wired up your own editor to sort of do the previewing of this while you were working on kicking the tires on the SQL function to begin with.
Yeah, I made a thing called PostGIS Preview, which was basically just a Carto-like SQL editor that was really dumbed down and simple. It was like a little React app, and it was meant to connect directly to PostGIS so that you could visualize spatial queries. So yeah, when I started messing around with the SQL feature in Qri, and I found quickly that there was a JSON export feature on the command line, which was pretty cool and well documented. So I was able to take that JSON response. I was basically able to like shim it into this front end with like 10 minutes of work screwing around with it, which was kind of neat. So I could just enter into the GUI and get a table back, and I was like, yeah, this should be in the app for sure. It's a much more friendly environment for tinkering with SQL queries and trying different variations on them. I've also been using, for my turnstile data, I've been using pgadmin quite a lot, and I hate it. But you know, it has so much other stuff in there because there's a million other features that you can do beyond just querying a table. And like, we need to, what Carto did that was so wonderful is just kind of throw all that away and just say, you've just got tables and you can write query on them. There's a whole lot more you can do if you know the syntax for it, but like, it kind of lowered the bar and the intimidation factor of Postgres and PostGIS. And I think that's something we should strive to emulate.
Deep agree. Deep agree. This is lovely. I think we've kind of covered it, other than we're going to try and cut it back and release either late tonight or early tomorrow. And that will include SQL. We're going to mark it as experimental, but we're not going to put it behind a flag. Yeah, we think there's too many things that need fixing that need to go out the door. So we want to get a patch out and keep moving. Rusty, did you have questions, comments, concerns, criticisms, foibles, thoughts?
No, I did not. I was just turn the video back on.
Cool. Yeah, unless anyone else has anything else, I'd love to sort of give everyone their time back. Rico.
Well, I was going to say, Rusty published a data set on the Cal Parks. And so I think this team has probably mostly read it, but I'd love to have you just walk us through it. I will keep wanting to call you Feep. I'm so sorry. Rusty, tell us about your experience, what you learned about Qri. I know a lot of this has been manifested in issues, but for anybody who watches this video that doesn't make it to our GitHub, I'd love for you to just talk to the intersection of your interest in the data project, how Qri supported it, whatever.
Okay, I'm unmuted. It wasn't really a data set that I had a good story about. It was more a data set that exercised a lot of what was in transforms. And so I wrote a Python script to get the data set for the first story, and so that I could rewrite it in Starlark. And second story is written. It's got a couple blockers on me trying to figure out validation and then having validation work properly for commit after I validate. But I think thanks to Holger, I got the validation working properly. I just need to get it committed without errors and get it published, and then that story's ready to go. And if you have any questions, I can answer them, but that's about as far as it goes with those two stories.
Cool.
This isn't a question, but just for your knowledge, validation in the app is not like, there is a section for validation in Schema, but it is broken and it's not So don't try and validate anything via the desktop app right now.
No. Almost everything I've done has been through query command line. Although I got to use checking validation and checking field values. I got to really use the desktop for the first time at the end of last week, and I was impressed. It was very nice.
Lovely. Cool. That gets us close to under the wire. Any like lingering questions, problems, issues, ideas?
I have what I put up in chat and really never heard back last week when Holger was talking about confusion around transforms. Is anybody, I suggested something and never heard any feedback. You have transform dry or save dry run. What if maybe a transform subcommand was made something that you could run and would act locally on a file system linked data set, and then it would be just like a hand edit, and if you liked what you got, you could commit that with a query save.
Right. I think I remember seeing this, and then I started thinking about it and confused myself enough that I didn't know how to reply and got distracted by something else. So sorry about that. But generally speaking, the way transforms work currently was designed before file system integration even existed. So there's a big mismatch in like the assumptions that it's making. I think what you're describing is probably along the lines of what we'll end up arriving at, but we've got to figure out things like how does a save path distinguish between one kind of save versus another. Whatever we do has to work both with, data sets that are checked out somewhere versus those that aren't. It's got to work over the API. So there's a lot of questions. We kind of just have to like align the assumptions that are in the save path with how users probably expect it to work. So yeah, it's something that we need to talk about. We've been putting it off. Probably can't do that any longer.
It is very confusing to me. And should I put it as an issue or just know it's in your guys' heads, or put it as a proposal, or?
Wait, you filed an issue about it, didn't you?
No, I did not. It's just in the Discord.
Gotcha.
I think this would make a great RFP issue.
Yeah, I think that makes sense.
And I would call them in-place transforms, personally.
Sorry, I said RFP because RFPs are on my mind. RFC or RFP?
That's the one.
That's the
RFC.
Okay.
Oh my gosh.
No, I was the one who said RFP, but that's because I was thinking about RFPs.
It's been a long year.
This is
Yeah.
the RFP for the RFC.
Yeah, no, I think it's a really interesting idea because I think it's, what I'm hearing from you is like, I just want to execute on a data set that's defined ad hoc and have the results be applied to the files.
I want to execute it, but more importantly, unless you do dry run, whatever you do commits, and that's not a good way to work when you're writing code to do not getting some stuff done, but you're basically testing.
Well, you're iterating on it. You're
Testing's the
developing it and trying to figure
you're
out what's going
iterating,
on.
and you don't want all that in your history.
Yep. Totally.
Yeah. And I mean, that's why so this release will fix dry run, which is imperative because
it makes dry run not break anymore, be broken, right?
That's better.
It removes that horrible bug that would corrupt your repo. But yeah, it doesn't get us to a place where we have a good story around like what the basics mean. Because like the thing is right now, going back originally, when you run a save command, we were treating it like you were patching a previous version to make a new version. And then transforms were a way of saying, this is a state transition from my old version to a new one by running code. And then the first assumption about patching datasets for save was invalidated by having file system integration, where now it's like, I have a current snapshot in a directory. Whatever I modify is the new version I want to be in my repository. So we don't have a way of talking about the semantics of what it means when you run a transform in a directory that's checked out. And yeah, we got to figure that out in a way that doesn't break other assumptions we have in the code base. It's tricky. It's complicated. I believe there's an answer, but I'm not sure what it is yet.
I'm so tempted to take a stab, but if anybody wants to just leave, let's just, yeah, we'll hammer it out in issues. Let's not waste everybody's time.
Yeah, I think it's bigger than just this meeting.
I think you're right. And Dustin should get the last word.
Well, thank you, everybody,
Rusty, you
for
should get the
thinking
last
about
word.
that.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, everybody, for thinking about that, because working with it as first-time user and not knowing the history of it, it's very confusing how it works. And that's not the only way it's confusing, just the assumptions stacked up on top of that.
Yeah, really
So
sorry about that.
rethink.
It was a thing that we were kind of ignoring because it hurts my brain. But we'll get back to it, I promise. We'll make it work great.
All right. Well, I look forward to seeing the issue in the RFC.
Well, you're going to file the RFC, right?
Oh, okay. I can file the RFC.
Tell me what you want to see.
To the guidance we give to RFC writers in the chat.
You don't have to write the RFC. File an issue saying this is how I want to make. Well, this is what sucks, and then we'll talk about how to make it into an RFC.
Okay. Thanks, guys.
Thanks so much, everybody. Delightful to see all of you.
Right on. Take it easy, everyone.